For years, Trump's tariffs were treated as untouchable, not just policy, power, a weapon wrapped in executive authority, sold as protection, defended as strength, enforced as law. Presidents changed, markets shifted, trade wars cooled and reignited, but one thing never happened. No court ever truly stopped them. Until now. Early this morning, inside a quiet courtroom far removed from campaign rallies and cable news panels, 6 justices did something no administration expected them to do. They ruled that President Trump's tariffs were illegal, not controversial, not questionable, illegal, 623, and the moment that decision hit the docket, Washington froze. Because this ruling isn't about trade policy anymore. It's about consequences, massive ones. Over $150 billion in potential refunds, money already paid, money already spent, money that, according to the court, should never have been collected in the first place. And that's where everything changes. The public version of this story sounds simple. Supreme Court reviews tariffs. Supreme Court overturns tariffs. End of headline. But what actually happened inside this case, how it reached the court, and why the ruling landed the way it did tells a much darker, more complicated story about executive power, legal shortcuts, and a system that finally said stop. Because here's what most people don't understand. These tariffs weren't struck down because judges suddenly changed their minds about trade. They were struck down because of how they were imposed, how authority was claimed, and how far that authority was stretched. The court wasn't asked whether tariffs are good or bad. It was asked whether a president can unilaterally impose sweeping economic penalties without clear congressional authorization, and then keep them in place indefinitely. For years, that question was avoided, deferred, kicked down the road. Today, it wasn't. The case that brought everything to a breaking point didn't start with politics. It started with paperwork, a challenge filed quietly by affected importers. Companies that had paid billions under protest, firms that kept records, filed objections, preserved evidence. While the political fight played out on television, a legal fight was moving through the courts. Line by line, statuto by statuto, and eventually it reached the one place where delay is no longer possible, inside the Supreme Court. The justices weren't debating Trump. They were debating limits, specifically the limits of emergency powers used in non-emergency conditions. The tariffs had been justified under statutes designed for rare circumstances, temporary threats, immediate dangers, not long-term trade strategy. That distinction mattered, because once the court accepted the argument that the justification no longer matched the reality, everything downstream collapsed. Authority without limits stops being authority and starts being overreached, and 6 justices agreed that line had been crossed. When the ruling dropped, federal agencies immediately began internal reviews. Treasury officials, customs officials, trade enforcement units, all asking the same question at the same time. If these tariffs were illegal, what happens to the money? That's where the $150 billion figure comes from. Conservative estimates, refund exposure, companies that paid consumers who absorbed costs, contracts written under assumptions that no longer hold. This isn't theoretical. These are claims already forming, legal teams already preparing filings, corporate attorneys already calculating recovery strategies, and inside Washington. The scramble is real, because refunds of this scale don't just hit spreadsheets. They hit budgets. They hit political narratives. They hit credibility. A government that collected money without legal authority docenti justo fezu embara cemento. It faces accountability. And that accountability doesn't stop at policy. This ruling also rewrites part of Trump's legacy in ways his supporters and critics both didn't expect. The tariffs were one of his signature economic moves, framed as strength, sold as leverage, defended as necessity. Now, the highest court in the country has said they never should have existed in the form they took. That doesn't just affect the past. It affects future presidents. Because this decision draws a bright line around executive trade power, a line that can't be crossed quietly again inside political circles. The reaction is split. Some see this as judicial overreach. Others see it as long overdue correction. But behind closed doors, strategists on both sides understand something deeper just happened. The Supreme Court didn't just strike down tariffs. It signaled that emergency authority is not a blank check. That economic power must return to Congress. That unilateral moves come with legal consequences, and now everyone who paid the price is asking the same question. Do we get our money back? That question is about to trigger the next wave of this story. Lawsuits, claims, appeals, budget fights, political blame. And the White House knows it, because once refunds begin, this ruling stops being legal theory and becomes financial reality. And we're only at the beginning. In the next part, we'll break down why the 6-3 split matters, what the dissent warned about, and how this decision could trigger one of the largest government refund battles in U.S. history. This ruling didn't close a chapter, it opened a much bigger one. What happened next is where this story stops being about trade policy and starts being about institutional power colliding in real time. Because when the Supreme Court issues a 6-3 ruling, it's not just a legal outcome. It's a signal, a message sent to the executive branch, to Congress, to the markets, and to every agency that spent years enforcing a policy that, as of this moment, no longer legally exists. The ruling didn't come with fireworks. No dramatic press conference. No televised announcement. Just a dense opinion released quietly, the way the most disruptive decisions often are. But inside Washington, phones started ringing immediately. Treasury officials, trade lawyers, White House aides, all scrambling to answer the same question. What now? Because this wasn't a narrow procedural loss. The court didn't just tweak a regulation or reinterpret a clause. They ruled that the legal authority used to justify Trump's tariffs was exceeded, that the executive branch went too far, that the mechanism used to impose billions in import taxes on foreign goods wasn't lawful under the statute it relied on. And that's where the $150 billion number comes in. For years, companies paid those tariffs, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes while suing in parallel, sometimes while quietly adjusting prices and passing costs down the supply chain to consumers who never realized why prices were rising. All of that money went somewhere, and now the court has effectively said it never should have been collected. In the first place, refunds are no longer a hypothetical, they're a looming obligation. Inside the White House, the reaction was controlled on the surface and chaotic underneath. Public statements emphasized respect for the court, the importance of the rule of law, the need to review the decision carefully. That language matters. It's the same language administrations use when they're buying time, because no one is ready to say out loud what this ruling could trigger. The Department of Justice now faces a cascade problem. Every tariff collected under the invalidated authority is a potential claim. Every importer who paid is now a potential plaintiff. And unlike political disputes that can be delayed or spun, financial claims come with deadlines, interest, and court orders. Trade lawyers are already calling this one of the most consequential economic rulings in decades. Not because of Trump, not because of politics, but because it redefines how much power a president actually has to reshape the economy without Congress. And this is where things get uncomfortable for both parties. Republicans defended the tariffs as necessary leverage, a tough love strategy against unfair trade practices. Democrats criticized them as reckless and inflationary. But both parties benefited from the revenue. Both parties allowed the system to operate, and now the court has pulled the legal floor out from under it. What makes this moment especially volatile is timing. The economy is already fragile. Inflation narratives are shifting, supply chains are stressed again, and suddenly the government may owe private companies sums large enough to affect budget projections, deficit calculations, and political messaging. Heading into an election cycle. Behind the scenes, agencies are scrambling to determine exposure, not just headline numbers, but how many claims are valid, which companies preserved their rights, which cases were stayed pending this ruling, which payments can legally be refunded and which will have to be litigated for years. And then there's the Trump factor. Because while the ruling is about tariffs, the name Trump is inseparable from the policy. His supporters see this as another example of institutions undermining his agenda after the fact. His critics see it as proof that his administration pushed boundaries without regard for legal limits. Both sides are mobilizing, fundraising, emails are being drafted, talking points are circulating, cable news panels are booking guests who haven't even read the opinion yet. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about yet. This ruling doesn't just affect past tariffs. It constrains future ones. It narrows executive authority in a way that will apply to whoever occupies the Oval Office next. That means Biden. That means Trump, if he returns. That means any president who thought tariffs were a convenient tool that didn't require Congress. The court just said otherwise. That's why this decision landed with such force inside Washington. Not because it settles a debate, but because it opens dozens of new ones about separation of powers, about economic nationalism, about how much damage can be undone once money has already changed hands. and undoing it won't be simple. Some refunds could take years. Some may never happen. Some companies may settle for partial repayment. Others will push for full restitution with interest. Every path forward is expensive. Every option is politically dangerous. And somewhere in the middle of all this, ordinary Americans are realizing something unsettling. The prices they paid, the costs they absorbed, the supply disruptions they endured, they were part of a system that the highest court in the country has now declared unlawful. That realization doesn't stay contained. It spreads into markets, into voter sentiment, into trust in institutions that are supposed to know where the legal lines are before crossing them. This ruling didn't just invalidate tariffs, it invalidated certainty. And that's why this story isn't over, not even close. Because once money is ruled illegal, the question is never just who gets it back. The question is who pays the price when the system has to correct itself. And that's where things are about to get very complicated. Now the consequences begin to take shape. And this is where the ruling stops being theoretical and starts becoming personal for people who never paid attention to tariff law, court opinions, or trade statutes before today, because this decision doesn't stay inside Washington. It moves outward quietly at first, through filings, through legal notices, through internal memos that never make headlines. And then suddenly, all at once, it's everywhere. Companies that paid tariffs for years are now pulling records. Accounting departments are reopening books they thought were closed forever. Legal teams are revisiting cases they paused, delayed, or strategically abandoned because the odds didn't seem worth it at the time. Those odds just changed. And when even a fraction of those companies decide to act, the numbers add up fast. That's why officials are nervous about saying too much. Once expectations are set, they're hard to walk back. If the government signals that refunds are coming, pressure explodes. If it signals resistance, lawsuits multiply. Either way, the dam is cracking. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that the ruling exposes something deeper than a single policy mistake. It exposes how fragile economic authority becomes when it's stretched too far, too fast, without clear legislative backing. The court didn't just disagree with how the tariffs were used, it said the justification itself didn't hold. That matters because justification is the foundation of executive power. Without it, actions unravel retroactively. And retroactive consequences are the most expensive kind inside federal agencies. Officials are now facing a cascade of questions they don't have clean answers for. Can refunds be limited? Can timelines be narrowed? Can Congress step in retroactively to shield the government from liability? Every option creates its own legal landmines. Every move risks creating precedent that will come back later in ways nobody can fully predict. Meanwhile, markets are watching closely, not reacting loudly yet, not panicking, but paying attention because when courts invalidate revenue streams after the fact, it introduces uncertainty into how policy is priced. It makes future government actions feel less permanent, less reliable. And in financial systems, reliability is everything. Then there's the political pressure building just beneath the surface. Trump allies are already framing the ruling as proof that his agenda was targeted, dismantled piece by institutions that never accepted it. Opponents are framing it as validation that his approach was reckless and legally unsound from the start. Both narratives are forming simultaneously, and both are being amplified, but neither narrative changes the math. If even a portion of that $150 billion becomes payable, it hits budgets that are already stretched thin. It forces trade-offs that no one wants to campaign on. It raises uncomfortable questions about who absorbs the cost when policy reversals collide with legal reality. And those questions don't stay abstract for long. They show up in appropriations, fights, in emergency funding requests, in quiet negotiations between agencies and congressional leadership, in decisions about what gets delayed, what gets cut, and what gets quietly pushed into the future. This is how systemic stress works. It doesn't announce itself with sirens. It accumulates pressure until something gives. The Supreme Court ruling didn't pull the trigger on immediate collapse. It introduced instability. And instability spreads slowly, then suddenly. That's why legal analysts are saying the most important effects of this decision won't be visible this week or even this month. They'll appear over time as cases move through lower courts, as refund claims stack up, as agencies struggle to implement guidance that satisfies judges without opening the floodgates completely. And through all of it, one truth remains unavoidable: the tariffs are gone. Not paused, not modified, gone, declared illegal by the highest court in the country. Everything built on them now has to be re-examined. Every assumption has to be tested. Every outcome has to be renegotiated. That's not a political problem. That's a structural one. And once structures start shifting, they don't always settle back into their original shape. This ruling has changed the landscape, not just for Trump, not just for trade policy, but for how power is exercised, justified, and challenged in the United States going forward. The full consequences haven't arrived yet, but the signal couldn't be clearer. Something that was once treated as settled law is no longer settled. And when that happens at this level, everyone eventually feels it. What comes next won't unfold all at once. It will arrive piece by piece, case by case, decision by decision. But the direction is set. And now, the country is moving into the aftermath of a ruling that quietly rewrote the rules, while most people were still catching up to what just happened. That's the part to watch, because once the fallout becomes visible, there won't be any way to pretend this was just another headline